1561. A weaving workshop, Segovia, Castile, Diego de Soria is 52 years old, and he has spent 3 decades building the largest wool textile operation in a city that has spent 2 centuries earning its reputation as the finest cloth-producing town in Spain. His looms employ close to 200 people. His wool comes from Castile's own merino flocks, the best in Europe. For most of his working life, Segovia cloth has clothed the Spanish court, the colonial administrators in Mexico City and Lima, and a respectable share of European nobility who could afford the quality. This year, for the first time, Diego watches 3 of his looms sit idle for an entire month. The buyers who once came to Segovia are now buying finished cloth from Antwerp, from Florence, from London. Cloth paid for not with Spanish coin earned through Spanish production, but with silver arriving by the ton from a mountain in Peru called Potosí. Spanish merchants have discovered something simpler than building textile mills. They can sail silver to Antwerp, buy finished goods cheaper and often better than what Segovia produces, and sail the goods back. Why fund the looms when the silver fleet does the work instead? Diego de Soria does not know it yet, but he is watching the opening act of the single financial mistake that will end Spain's century and a half as the wealthiest power on earth. Not a war, not a single bad king. A decision, made by thousands of merchants and royal officials simultaneously, that silver itself was wealth, rather than treating it as the fuel that should have built something Spain could keep producing long after the silver fleet stopped arriving. Stay with me. To understand why this mistake was so easy to make and so difficult to reverse once made, you need to understand just how much silver was actually arriving and how reasonable it felt, at every individual step, to spend it the way Spain spent it. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain imported an estimated 16,000 tons of silver and 185 tons of gold from its American territories, bullion that, by some economic historians' estimates, roughly tripled the total silver supply circulating in Europe. The flow ran through Seville's Casa de Contratación, the royal house of trade that controlled and taxed every ounce legally entering Spain, and from there into the hands of the crown, the merchant houses, and eventually the broader economy. The crown's share went overwhelmingly to war. Spain was fighting on multiple fronts almost continuously for over a century in silver-financed armies, fleets, and the enormous web of loans from Genoese and Flemish bankers that kept those campaigns running. This was, in its own context, defensible. A composite empire spanning multiple continents needed defending, and silver paid for that defense more reliably than Castilian taxation ever could. The merchant share went somewhere quieter and, in the long run, far more consequential. Spanish silver flowed out to purchase the manufactured goods that a wealthy, silver-flush population wanted, and increasingly, that Spain's own producers could no longer compete to sell. Here is the mechanism that converted Spanish wealth into Spanish de-industrialization, and it is more precise than simply Spain got rich and got lazy. The flood of American silver produced what economic historians call the price revolution, a sustained dramatic rise in prices across 16th century Europe, with Spain experiencing the sharpest increases of any major economy. Prices in Castile roughly quadrupled between 1500 and 1600. Wages rose too, but with a lag, and the inflation hit Spain first and hardest, simply because the silver entered the European economy through Spanish ports, before spreading outward to the rest of the continent. This created a brutal competitive trap for Diego de Soria and every producer like him. Castilian wages and raw material costs rose faster than wages in England, the Netherlands, or northern Italy, regions receiving the inflationary spillover from Spanish silver later and more gradually. A bolt of cloth produced in Segovia became, year after year, more expensive to make than the same bolt produced in Flanders. Spanish merchants, acting entirely rationally within this new price structure, simply bought the cheaper foreign product. Nobody conspired against Spanish industry. The arithmetic did the work on its own. Now, here's the critical part. The Crown's own fiscal policy accelerated the damage rather than correcting it. The alcabala, Castile's primary sales tax, applied at every stage a good changed hands, compounding heavily on domestically produced goods that passed through multiple stages of processing and trade within Castile itself. Imported finished goods, arriving as a single transaction, often escaped much of that compounding burden. Castile had, in effect, built a tax structure that penalized its own manufacturing supply chain more heavily than it penalized buying the finished product from a foreign competitor. Spanish economic writers of the era, the arbitristas, men like Martín González de Chelorigo, who published his analysis in 1600, saw this clearly and said so publicly. Their warnings changed almost nothing, because the silver kept arriving, and as long as it did, the consequences of the trap remained easy to postpone. Here is what the trap actually cost Spain, measured in the thing that should have mattered most: productive capacity that doesn't disappear when the silver stops. By the 1680s, by various contemporary and historical estimates, a substantial majority of the manufactured goods consumed within Spain itself, textiles, hardware, paper, even basic tools, were arriving from abroad. Spain, sitting on the largest empire on earth, had become a country that exported raw wool and silver and imported almost everything made from them. England and the Dutch Republic, meanwhile, were doing something structurally different with far smaller bullion windfalls of their own. They were building shipping fleets, financial institutions, and manufacturing capacity that did not depend on a silver galleon arriving on schedule from across an ocean controlled by pirates, storms, and increasingly aggressive English privateers. When Potosí's most easily accessible silver veins began running thinner in the early 1600s, and as smuggling, piracy, and the rising consumption needs of Spain's own American colonies reduced the silver actually reaching Seville, Spain discovered the cost of the mistake all at once. The war still needed funding, if the Genoese bankers still wanted repayment, and the productive base that might have generated tax revenue independent of the silver fleet had spent a century atrophying, loom by loom, town by town. Castile's population is estimated to have fallen by close to a quarter during the 17th century's worst decades, driven by plague, emigration, and an economy that simply could not employ the people it once had. Segovia's textile industry, which employed thousands in Diego de Soria's era, had shrunk to a fraction of its former size by the 1680s. The empire did not lose its colonies yet. It took until the 19th century. It lost something that mattered more immediately: the ability to fund itself from anything other than a silver supply it no longer controlled the volume of. Here's the dimension of this story that makes it relevant far beyond 16th century Spain. Because the mechanism Spain discovered, almost by accident, has a name economists still use today, and a modern economy is currently running a version of it at a scale Spain never approached. A country that can finance imported consumption using something other than the output of its own domestic producers will, almost mechanically, see its domestic production atrophy relative to what it would have been otherwise. For Spain, that something other was silver. For the modern United States, it is the dollar's reserve currency status, the unique privilege of issuing the currency that the rest of the world needs to hold, trade in, and accept in payment. America has run a current account deficit in nearly every year since the 1970s, importing more in goods than it exports, financing the difference not through competitive manufacturing exports, but through the world's continuing demand for dollar-denominated assets, treasury bonds in particular. This is not a moral failing. It is, like 16th century Spain's silver economy, a structurally rational response to having access to a financing mechanism that most other countries simply do not have. American consumers, like Spanish merchants in Diego de Soria's era, can buy manufactured goods more cheaply from abroad than from domestic producers, because the financing of that purchase doesn't depend on American factories generating the trade surplus to pay for it. American manufacturing's share of GDP has fallen from roughly 28% in 1953 to approximately 11% today, a decline that accelerated sharply after China's 2001 entry into the World Trade Organization, the modern equivalent of Antwerp's cloth merchants discovering they could sell into Castile more cheaply than Castile could sell to itself. Here is why this comparison is not simply rhetorical. Spain's experience offers a specific warning about what happens when the financing mechanism that enabled the imports eventually weakens. Spain's silver flow did not disappear overnight. It declined gradually, across decades, even as the wars and the debts it had been financing continued growing. The productive capacity that might have cushioned that decline had already been allowed to shrink during the decades when the silver still seemed limitless. By the time Spanish ministers fully grasped what had happened, the textile towns, the shipyards, and the manufacturing base that England and the Netherlands had spent the same century building no longer had a Spanish equivalent capable of catching up quickly. The dollar's reserve currency privilege is, by most measures, more durable than Spanish silver ever was, backed by deeper capital markets, military reach, and institutional infrastructure that took decades to build and that has no readily available substitute today. But the structural mechanism connecting the financing privilege to domestic de-industrialization is the same mechanism Diego de Soria watched operate in his own looms in 1561. Cheap, externally financed imports outcompete domestic production. Domestic production, once it shrinks past a certain point, becomes expensive and slow to rebuild, even after the financing advantage that allowed its decline eventually narrows. This channel exists to find the mechanism while the looms are still running. Diego de Soria's grandson inherited a much smaller workshop than the one Diego built, fewer looms, fewer workers, a market for Segovia cloth that had shrunk to a regional remnant of what it once supplied across an empire spanning 2 hemispheres. None of this happened because any single Spaniard made a catastrophic decision. It happened because thousands of individually reasonable choices, repeated across a century, redirected the most extraordinary resource, windfall in early modern history, away from building anything that could outlast the silver itself. Subscribe if you want to keep watching how that mechanism shows up in modern economies, long before anyone names the decade it happened in. And I want your argument in the comments. Spain's silver-financed de-industrialization took roughly a century to become visible, and by the time the arbitristas were writing about it, clearly in 1600, the productive base was already too diminished to rebuild quickly. Is America's manufacturing decline, financed by a different but structurally similar privilege, at the 1561 stage of the story or the 1600 stage? Drop your argument below. The clearest one gets pinned.